All right, the subject matter today is that of returning God's liberality. Obviously, the subject in general would be that of giving. And this is a subject that is generally among our people, is generally not discussed enough. It's interesting. You know, there is a marked difference in the attitudes of God's people with regard to the subject of giving, as opposed to the denominational side of that coin, wherein there's always pleas for money. There's always a reminder of what they call giving your tithes and whatnot. Some churches that I know of, if you are absent, they will send you an envelope for you to send in your tithes so that you can mail it back to them. And so, there's really a dichotomy among the Lord's people and those in denominationalism over the matter of giving. And it probably should come as no surprise that, at least in my experience, those that are in denominationalism are better givers than those that are in the Lord's church. Because when there's an emphasis placed on a certain thing, then there will be attention given to that thing. And where there is no emphasis given to a thing, then there will be no diligence in that thing. As an example, I never remember but one time hearing a sermon on giving in my home congregation. In fact, if you were to talk to some of the preachers who were there, I'm almost halfway convinced that they were told not to. And I remember one time when I was in probably in about junior high or so, and I don't even remember who this guy was. He wasn't anybody that certainly was memorable, but they brought in somebody for the sole purpose to preach on the subject of giving. It wasn't V.P. Black or some great gospel preacher who'd written about it and preached on it many times. But I recall distinctly on that day, the church giving was down about 50% on the day that the guy came to preach on giving. And I also remember the conversation, in other words, like, we'll show you. I also remember when I set out 25 or so years ago to start preaching on giving here, and I made the comment that I had preached, I think, 5 consecutive Sundays on the subject of giving. And it surprised my mom that there was that much in the Bible to be taught on giving. But the reason for that was she'd lived in a time and attended a place where there was no attention given to the subject. And so if you don't hear things about that subject, then you don't realize that they're there. Or even if you are looking or reading those things, it doesn't click. It doesn't click with you. And so this is a vitally important subject because giving is a matter of worship. It deserves all the attention that our focus on the Lord's Supper might have. It deserves the same attention that teaching the truth on our singing would have. Our teaching on prayer, our teaching about teaching and preaching. This is equally important as any matter of worship, and yet oftentimes finds its way somewhere in the bottom of the stack, never to be seen or heard from again. Now, V.P. Black said, and you have to understand what I'm saying here. V.P. Black and nobody in the brotherhood did more and better work than V.P. Black on the subject of giving. He probably wrote a half a dozen workbooks, class books on the subject of giving. Probably preached on giving more than any other gospel preacher coming out of the Depression era. and he made the statement. He said that almost 20% of all of the teaching of Jesus concerns money. Now, it doesn't mean that it concerns money in the fact that it's teaching about giving, but just that Jesus used money a lot in his examples of things that he was teaching. For example, the parable of the talents, the 5-talent man, the 2-talent man, the 1-talent man. A talent was a measurement of weight that was directly connected to money. They didn't have the paper money, so it'd be a talent of gold or a talent of silver. And so the Bible is filled. The Bible is filled with references to giving and to money, and particularly the teaching of Jesus. And on the top of the page, on page 32, on the right-hand side, it says the Bible teaches liberal giving to support the work of the church. In fact, as much is said about giving as is said about any other duty we have. And I just changed the last 3 words as any other act. There's more on giving than any act of worship. There's more teaching on the subject of giving than any other aspect of worship. If you just stacked up, for example, you just wanted to stack up the number of verses. Now, I'm going to throw this out to you. Why do you think there's more on the Bible with regard to giving than there is any other matter of worship? Why? All right, giving is in some ways is done outside of worship. What's another?
God gives us liberally, and we need to show His love.
All right, because God gives to us, and we need to give to Him. But what's another reason? Why is there more teaching on the New Testament about giving as worship than every other form and act of worship? Why? Thank you, Ann. Thank you. Because people love their money. People love their money. You tell a man he's got to take the Lord's Supper every week. Good. Tell a man he's got to sing and make melody in his heart. Tell a man he needs to pray. Tell a man he needs to study his Bible. Tell a man he needs to give until it hurts. You see where we just ran off a cliff? There's more teaching because the Lord understands our attitude that we have about our money and our possessions. And it goes all the way back to the days of the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, God, through Moses, is talking to His people. And He's telling them, and by the way, the conquest of Canaan was unlike any other military conquest in the history of mankind. Insofar that Canaan was not destroyed before Israel came in to occupy it. In other words, if the Assyrians came in and conquered a nation, what did they do? They laid it to waste. If the Babylonians came in, they laid it to waste. And that would be the case with every single dynasty or military conquest in all of human history. But the conquest of Canaan was different. God drove those people out of their homes and out of their farmland and left everything intact for the children of Israel to come in. By the way, this is something that you can even read about in archaeological research. I mean, this kind of stuff is available online, how unique the conquest of Canaan was as opposed to every other type, of conquest before and after. I mean, what did Germany do to Poland? What did they try to do to England? What did Japan, and then what did we do to Japan? I mean, that's how you win wars. But the conquest of Canaan was different. God drove those people out. They didn't just have to come in there and lay waste to it. So the houses were standing, the fields were plowed, the vineyards, the vineyards were intact. The orchards, everything is, it's move-in ready. It's move-in ready. And Moses reminds the people, when you walk into this land that flows with milk and honey, and you start living in houses that you didn't build and drinking water out of wells you didn't dig. By the way, that's another thing that would happen in a conquest. They'd fill all the wells full of dirt and rocks. Or you can even think even more recently, what did Grant do? What did Grant do as he went across the South? He burned it to the ground, and then what else did he do? He sowed salt in all the fields. He salted the farmland. So not only did he burn it to the ground, that all the farmland was salted to keep it from being able to produce crops. And so the children of Israel are living in houses they didn't build, drinking water out of wells they didn't dig, eating grapes off of vineyards they've never tended, pulling fruit, olives or whatever fruit off of trees they didn't plant or prune. Not having, plowing fields that already had the rocks removed. And Moses reminds the people, when you have eaten and are full, you better be careful not to forget the Lord your God. And then he reminds them, he says, in verse 18, it's God who gives you power to get wealth. It's God who gives you power to get wealth. Notice, all the things that you're fixing to inherit were given to you by God, and all the wealth that you would accumulate as a result of that blessing will also be a gift from God. And so it's always been understood how men feel about their money and about their possessions. And the subject of covetousness, the subject of greed, the subject of envy. These all surround money. Poor people resent rich people because, and I know you've probably heard this, because poor people say everybody that's rich got it because they stole it from somebody. You ever heard that? He's rich because he stole it from somebody. No, he didn't. It might be the case that somebody got rich by dishonest means, but most people don't. And so envy, greed, jealousy, covetousness, these are all things that we all fall prey to. So I think there's more teaching on it because, like Ann said, God knows we love our money. He knows that we love our money. We love our possessions. And people resent, and this is on the top of the left-hand side, that people resent what the Lord says about stewardship. By the way, there is not one passage in all the New Testament that teaches that Christians are to tithe. There are no tithing texts for the church. The word tithe means a tenth. It's what it literally means. It means a tenth. And it comes from the Old Testament, where there were certain tithes that were to be paid by the Jews to support the Levites, because the Levites were given no land inheritance, so all the other tribes were to give a portion of what they had to support the Levites so that they could do their work, which was ultimately for the Lord. All right? But to confine the giving of the Jews to a tithe is completely miss the Old Testament altogether. They think about a tithe, and the word tithes appears in a number, but there's also, in addition to tithes, there's also offerings. You can read about tithes and offerings God said in Malachi, you've robbed me. They said, how have we robbed you? He said, in your tithes and offerings. In other words, you haven't brought your tithes and you haven't brought your offerings. You've robbed me. That belongs to me. And you've withheld it from me. To withhold something that is due to an individual, to willfully withhold from an individual what is due to them, is not a particle different than taking something from someone that belongs to them. Is that right? If I owe you a thing and I don't pay it, it's the same as if you had it and I took it. And so God says, you've robbed me in tithes and offerings. Now, the idea of tithes is, for example, the livestock would be marched through, and every 10th one belonged to the Lord. Ma'am.
Promote growth. Promote growth.
Right. Evangelism. All of the things that it goes towards growing the church. I can see you don't agree with me, but that was what just was on my mind.
I'm only going to disagree. I'm only going to disagree with part of it, and I'm going to explain why. The churches in this area 100 years ago, it didn't cost them any money to educate their kids in church. They didn't buy Sunday school material at Barn Creek and White House and Burleson in the 1920s. Those things didn't exist. They taught their kids without those things. It didn't cost any money to make unleavened bread. The buildings were far less opulent and comfortable than they are now, and many times people donated lumber and labor to build the buildings.
It was still money from somebody, though.
But
to build a building, it took money from somebody.
I understand.
That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying necessarily coming here and putting cash.
But that's what I'm talking about.
They also didn't know the money we have to give.
That's true. That's true too.
Those people were good stewards of what they had.
All right. So there are things that the church does. I mean, this building is an expedient. It's not required. It's not necessary. And it's certainly not required to be as nice as it is. All right. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the building that we have, that it's sinful. But I've worshiped in a whole lot of places a lot worse than this. All right.
It'd be really hard to come here and worship today without peace.
It might be. It might be, but you'd say the same thing in the summer about air conditioning, and yet there's people all over the world that worship without heat and air conditioning, all the time. But there are obligations. Yeah, some of y'all are shaking your head like you wouldn't come if there wasn't heating and air conditioning. You got a heart problem. You got a problem. But there are obligations that the church has, like relieving the needy. In fact, almost all of the giving passages in the New Testament are directly connected to relieving the needs of the saints. Those things take money. Paul said, lay it by in store so that there's no gathering when I come. Supporting missionaries takes money. Paul received support from churches. He even told the Corinthians, I robbed, and he used this term intentionally, I robbed other churches, taking money from them so that I could do the work that I'm doing for you. But he said that to shame them, because they wouldn't support him for the work that he was doing, and other people had to support him for the work that they very easily could have supported him to do. Galatians 6 and verse 6 says that the local preachers are to be supported. Let him that is taught share with him who teaches in all things. So yes, there are things that take money. There are things that take money, but the very fundamental aspects of the church do not require a lot of money. All right, and so but again, I think it goes back to the Lord understands how we feel about our stuff, and so looking at let's go down in the middle of the or not in the middle, in the top third there. It says, and this line troubles me. Okay, it's underneath the section on the fundraising schemes and religious racketeers. It says, you need to know how much God expects you to give. That statement is problematic because of what it implies. It says, every good thing has come from Him. James 1:17, every good gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. We are only stewards of what we possess. That is true. Even Solomon said, as rich as he was, when he died, he had to leave it to somebody else. You know, Solomon was the first to say, "You can't take it with you. I have to leave it to somebody else." We're only stewards. It's not mentioned in this part of the lesson, but 1 Corinthians 4:2 it says that a steward is to be found faithful. It's required of stewards to be found faithful. 1 Corinthians 4 and verse 2. And so, and the word steward comes from two words, a sty and a ward. Of course, a sty would be something that kept animals, and a ward meant the person who watches over it, like a warden, watches over prisoners. So the steward comes from the idea of somebody has something, and you're in charge of making sure that everything is done properly. That's the kind of the root. And so we're simply stewards of what God has, because ultimately it all belongs to Him. And 1 Timothy 6:17 tells us that it's not a sin to be rich. I knew a man as a member of the church when I lived and worked at the co-op. He said he thought it was a sin to be rich because the Bible says it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, he didn't understand the passage properly. Jesus said in another place, those that trust in their riches cannot go to heaven. That's the context. Those that trust in their riches cannot go to heaven. Because 1 Timothy 6:17 says, command those that are rich in this world to be ready to share. To lay up a good foundation for themselves in heaven. And so we know it's not a sin to be rich. In fact, almost every Bible character that we know of was wealthy, except for the apostles and the Lord Himself. Paul was wealthy. The Pharisees were rich. Paul was wealthy, but he didn't trust in his wealth. Even at the end of Acts, it said he lived in his own hired house for 2 years in Rome, while he is awaiting trial. Now, we'll look at it here in just a few moments, Lord willing, in our worship assembly. Jeremiah bought some property from prison in Jeremiah 32. That's not to say he was rich, but it just simply notes that he was a man of some, at least of some means. And so 1 Corinthians 16 says, as I have given commandment to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. You do the same. On the first day of every week, let every one of you lay by him in store as God has prospered him. Lay by in store as God has prospered him. By the way, the word every is in the text, even though most translations do not render it. The word is there. The first day of every week. All right, and then he says that the purpose of that is so that there be no gatherings when I come. Because Paul's on his way through. He's going to Corinth, and he's going to gather up everything that's been given so that it can be carried back to Judea and relieve the saints there because of the famine. And we read more about it in the book of 2 Corinthians. In fact, 2 whole chapters are dedicated to this matter in 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. And so we're to lay by in store. That means that it's already been determined It's already set aside on the first day of every week. And then the Bible says, as God has prospered him. As God has prospered him. And so there's the measure. We give as we have been prospered. There's no 10% or 15% or no, there's no percentage, because if a percentage is attached to a thing, then we can check mark it. Does that make sense? In other words, God told me I got to give this percentage, and I'm going to give exactly this percentage. I'll figure it up all the way down to the penny. I'll give, and I will have fulfilled my obligation. But that's not how God wants us to give.
That takes the prosperity out of it.
Well, it part of it, but it also takes the heart out of it. We've got to have our hearts in it. As a man. Every man as he's purposed in his heart, so let him give. Not according to some actuary table or whatever you want to call it. Some table that God demands that everybody give according to. Not according to like a tax bracket. As he's purposed in his heart, so let him give. God loves a cheerful giver, and there's a blessing associated with it. That a man who sows sparingly reaps sparingly. A man who sows bountifully reaps bountifully. Every man as he's purposed in his heart, so let him give. Because God loves a cheerful giver. And so that's 2 Corinthians 9. That's 2 Corinthians 9 verses 6 and 7. But I want you to look at 2 Corinthians just for a moment. As we look at some other things that are mentioned in regard to giving. In the first 7 verses of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, in the first seven verses, Paul holds up the Macedonians as an example of giving to the Corinthians. And he says in verse 3, I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And so again, the collection is connected to the relief for the saints. And he says they out of their great poverty they gave. And not only according to their ability, but beyond their ability. And he says in verse number 5, says they first gave themselves to the Lord and then gave to us. They first gave themselves to the Lord. In other words, if I give myself to the Lord, that means everything that I have also belongs to the Lord. It's not like I give myself to the Lord, but I get to withhold my possessions from the Lord. If I give myself to the Lord, then everything that's under my control is understood to belong to the Lord. And then he says in verse 7, he commends the church there on their current level of spirituality. He says, but as you abound in everything, in speech, or in faith, and speech, and knowledge, all diligence, and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. In other words, don't do all of these things with great success and fall short and fall short here. Be consistent. And so he points this out. And then in verse number 12 of chapter 8, Paul makes the statement. He says, for if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. In other words, my giving is judged by God. Judges my giving based on my ability, and my giving is not compared to anybody else's giving. I still remember a great example of this, and I won't call her name because she's still living. even though she's not with us here now. When my folks had first started, when they'd moved down here and they were worshiping with us at Burleson. And for a while, Mom served as the treasurer. Isn't that right? Didn't she write the checks for a while? And so Mom was the treasurer. And so after the money would be counted, Mom and Freeman would take it home and count it. And on one particular Sunday, usually toward the end of the year, which was kind of my custom, I had preached on giving. And one of our widows, who every week wrote a check for $5 on either the Sunday of or the Sunday after that sermon, wrote a check for $6. Now, let me ask you something. Her husband didn't leave her anything. All right? She basically lived off of what little Social Security that she drew, off of him. And it's always struck me. At that time, I'd say our budget was probably, I'm just going to guess. I'm going to guess at that time our budget was probably $1,700, $1,800 a week. Do you think that, in the broad scheme of things, did that dollar make a big difference? Not in the broad scheme of things, it didn't. Not in whether or not we're going to pay our bills. She was. And that's the point. For her, it made a big difference. It made a big difference. But think about it. Could she have said in her mind, I can increase my giving by $1, but it really won't make a big difference? Could she say that? Nobody will ever know if I give essentially $5 or $6 and it won't make any difference. She could have said that, right? But she didn't. Kind of like the widow with the 2 mites. She's done. She did what she could. Her giving is judged based on what she had, and not on what she didn't have. It wasn't compared. Her giving wasn't compared to anybody else other than her own ability. And by the way, just like in Mark 12, where the widow is held up as an example for the whole world, her example, being made known to me, has now been used as an example for all of us. And so not only is it a powerful, it wasn't a huge amount, but it was a huge example. It was a powerful example for us, and it's a great example of verse number 12. Then down to verse number 24 in this text. Verse number 24. It says, therefore show to them and before the churches the proof of your love and our boasting on your behalf. So Paul directly connects their giving as an expression of their love. It's an expression of their love. Now, we oftentimes don't think of it in those terms, and yet we do think of it in a host of other areas. Like what we get our kids for Christmas, what we get our spouses for Christmas, or their birthday, or their anniversary, or for no reason whatsoever. What are those things? They're an expression of what? Our love. And again, it doesn't have to be something big, but it's something that expresses love.
And it can be taught somewhat too.
Ma'am?
It can be taught somewhat too. Because I remember I was in 7th grade and I had a babysitting job. And I made $1 an hour. And I think it was 2 hours every week, and I had to give.
Yeah.
Part of that, my parents made me give part of that. If I had a summer job, I had to give from that. And I'm not saying that if I had grown up without that, that I wouldn't have had the love in my heart to give. But that example
Probably at the time you thought you were being forced.
Oh, I was being forced. There's no doubt in my mind I was being forced. I didn't have the love then because I was a desperate college student that really needed that money, I thought, for something else. You know, there was always something else that I could use that money.
Oh yeah, always something out there.
Right, but it was instilled in me at an early age, just as some other biblical things were instilled in me.
Yeah, it like anything else, it needs to be taught. I mean, just like you're talking about, it needs to be taught.
But just hearing it or making someone do it is two different things.
Right. Yeah, I remember when, not long after we married him, we were talking about going to buy a house. You know, we'd sit down and we'd mapped out our budget, and it was a monthly budget. And we sat down with Mom and Freeman, and we were talking about these things. And I had accidentally, in the budget that I had written out, where it's supposed to, everything was a monthly expense, I had accidentally put our weekly giving as a monthly giving. And as soon as my mom saw that, she tore me up. Now, it wasn't that. What's that?
I thought we were given that.
She thought we were giving that every month, but it was just a mistake on my part. You know, because that's you pay all your bills every month, so the number that you pay is the one that's in your head, whereas your giving is every week. So that was the number that was in my head, and I put my weekly giving as our monthly giving. And my mom was going to chew me out, and I'm like, whoa, Mom, mistake on my part, mistake on my part. But here I am 21 years old, and my mom's still putting it on me, about the need to give. And by the way, my mom was taught by her dad about that, because both of my mom's brothers worked for their daddy, my grandpa, and he wrote all the checks, and he was the church treasurer. So he not only knew how much money he paid them, he knew how much money they gave. And he let them know. He let them know if he didn't think they was giving enough. And those men in their 30s, and still needing to be reminded. And I'm not. But the point wasn't that my grandpa always had to stay on my uncles about their giving. The point was that they knew that he was watching. And that was a powerful motivator, and not just because they gave to make their dad happy. They gave because they'd been instructed properly, and so there are a lot of factors that go into our giving. I've always said, if your giving does not significantly change the way you live, you're not giving enough. If it doesn't significantly change the way that you live, you're not giving. How can it be called a sacrifice if it doesn't change anything about the lifestyle that you live? I'm not talking about that you have to give enough that you can't afford to live in a house. That's not what I'm talking about. But it has to make a difference. And look, the Bible doesn't teach tithing. In the Old Testament, those people gave a lot more than 10%. There were certain things where they had to give 10%. But then there were other areas where they had to give. They couldn't cut the corners of their fields. If they dropped a sheaf on the way out, it had to lay there. You couldn't go back and pick it up. When you gathered olives, you could only beat the tree one time and everything else was left. In other words, you didn't get the full amount of the production. So there were a lot of other ways that the Jews gave. And then there were 3 free will offerings. And the Lord said, every man 20 years old and up will come before me, and nobody better come empty-handed. So in addition to all of those things, there were 3 free will offerings that were given. And so the Jews gave a lot more than 10% of their income. Now, I'm not comparing us to them because we don't live under the same system that they lived under. But just ask yourself, 10%. Let's put it this way: if you multiplied your giving by 10, if you multiplied your weekly giving by a factor of 10, could you live on that the way you live now? If you multiplied your, and that's just kind of figuring again. I said the Bible doesn't teach tithing in the New Testament, but just as a matter of comparison, if you made 10 times what you give every Lord's Day, what kind of standard of living would you have? That's a pretty serious question. All right, we'll go there and then start day 21, Lord willing, next week. We'll close this out next week at the bottom of page 32, and then move on into page 33. Y'all gonna go with us today? Yeah. I figured you might.